Any technique or tip that can save you and I boatloads of time is worth investigation, including using templates and cloning. Let's begin. I'd like you to imagine that you and I are at work and we've been asked to roll out 100 brand new virtual machines. Now, there's several ways we could go about that. Number one, we could do it manually, like we did in a previous nugget where we created a brand new virtual machine. It ran Linux. So we created the virtual machine, installed the operating system, customized it, and poof, it was done. So that would be one down of our new 100 and 99 to go. And I suppose if we were being paid by the hour, and we could get away with that, maybe that's the way to do it. However, time is extremely valuable, and we have some really amazing tools in a vSphere environment to help ease the pain of rolling out new machines, and allows us to do it very, very quickly. And it involves the idea of using templates like cookie cutters to create new machines from templates, and also cloning. So let's talk about templates first. You think of a template like the perfect source to use for a virtual machine. And here's how it works. We'd take a virtual machine, and we would customize it and get it absolutely perfect. Everything done. The patches, the software, the tweaking, everything we want that virtual machine to have. We get it perfect, and then we can go ahead and clone that over to a template. So what a template basically is, it's the whole virtual machine, in this case the one it was cloned from, that you cannot run. And that's a good thing. We don't want our templates to be able to run, because if they could run, somebody might change something. So in this example, we created the perfect virtual machine, we cloned it over to a template, and then from this template we can create brand new VMs based on that template. So in the process of cloning, we'd have the original VM, the source VM, and the template. Now, if we didn't want to clone, we also have the option of taking the original VM and actually converting it, which means the original VM is no longer a VM, it's now turned into a template. In either case, you end up with a template you can use to create new VMs from. Another option that we could do to create a template is we could take an existing template and we could clone that. So we could clone a template to create another template. And then from that template, we could deploy new VMs. So whether you clone a VM, convert a VM, or clone a template, the idea is that deploying from a template is very, very easy and just takes a few clicks. Now, as we consider creating brand new virtual machines based on a template, there are some serious things that we need to consider. One is the names of the VMs. We don't want to have 10 VMs all called Linux-1, for example, or VM2. So we have some mechanisms in place where we can tweak and tune the name of the VM when we're creating a VM from a template. We also have some options regarding networking that we can customize. In a Windows environment, I've got a question for you. In a Windows environment, what might be one of the considerations that we don't want to be exactly the same on every single new VM? And if you worked in a Windows environment, what might be coming to mind is SID, the Windows Security Identifier. We don't want to have two VMs on the same network from a Microsoft networking perspective with the exact same SID, because if they both are part of the domain, that's going to cause a problem. So we have some customization options regarding security IDs in Windows for Windows VMs, and we also have some licensing options. And the benefit of that is that if you're in an environment where you have a site license or you want to use a specific set of licenses, we can go ahead and customize the deployment and use those licenses. Now, the other challenge is that if we had to do a lot of input every single time of all these elements for a new VM, that might be repetitious. So we can save time as well by using a customization specification. And what that basically is, doing a lot of this work ahead of time in a specification. Let's say we have a custom specification and we call it Linux Custom Spec with the settings for our Linux machines. And then we could create another custom specification and call it Microsoft Custom Spec. And then as we're creating VMs based on a template, as part of the install process, we could check the box that says we want to do customization, and then furthermore, we could select from our list of customization specifications which custom spec we want to use when we deploy the VM. For our demonstration, let's go ahead and take a VM. Let's take our Linux 1 virtual machine. Let's say it's this guy right here. And let's say that's the perfect virtual machine. So in creating a template from this quote-unquote perfect virtual machine, we could either clone it, which would leave the existing virtual machine, or we could go ahead and convert it. If you like to have the original still in place, sitting somewhere, then the cloning option would be appealing. If we don't need to have the original VM hanging around, we just want a template, then the conversion option could be chosen. So regardless of which method we use to get to the point where we have the template of this VM, before we do that process to get the template, one of the things that a lot of times happens is there will be something on this VM that we forget to check. For example, if there's a DVD drive or a CD drive and it has 3 GB on that CD/DVD ROM that's logically connected to this virtual machine, stored, for example, somewhere on the data store, with the other files supporting that virtual machine. Well, if we leave that DVD drive attached and then we create a template from it, guess what comes over? Everything, including the drive. So our template is going to be larger than maybe we intended it to be. And then when we deploy our 100 VMs, they are all going to have that DVD drive. And if it's 3 gig per virtual machine, and we have 100 virtual machines, doing the quick math here, that's 300 gigabytes of additional storage that if we weren't intending on that or we didn't want that, that would be something we could easily avoid by simply removing that media and having it not connected to that virtual machine before we go ahead and make our template. Here on DCNUG, which we're using as our management station, let's go ahead and double click on the shortcut for the vSphere web client right here. And I'm going to bring that full screen as well. And then we'll log on as the user administrator at vSphere.local and supply our lab password. And then we'll click login. So to begin here in the vSphere web client, let's go ahead and click on this icon right here, which is the VMs and templates. That just gives us a view of our data center regarding any VMs or templates that we currently have. In fact, you know what? Let's organize this a little bit more, because if we have dozens of templates and hundreds of VMs, having folders to organize those would be very nice. So let's create a couple of folders to organize our VMs and templates. So we'll right click on the Las Vegas data center, and from the drop down, we'll hover over new folder, and then it's asking us what type of folder would we like to create. And we want to create a new VM and template folder. So we'll go ahead and click on that option from the submenu. And let's name this folder VMs. How about that? And we'll click on OK. So now we have this VMs folder. It's empty. And because we are going to be creating at least one template, let's also go ahead and right click on the data center and hover over new folder. And from the submenu, select new VM and template folder one more time. And we'll call this folder templates. And click OK. Now it's not required to have these folders. It's just great for organization. So if we use the little arrows on the left of each of those folders to expand them, we can see that they're empty. And if we want to move stuff around, we can simply move our VMs into that VMs folder. So if we can just click and drag the Linux-1, and we'll click and drag it. And anytime we have that little green plus symbol, that indicates, hey, you can drop it here. So we'll do it. And that puts our Linux 1 virtual machine logically in that VMs folder. And we'll also move our vCenter server VM into that folder by clicking on the VM and dragging and dropping it over to the VMs folder. Fantastic. So we've got 2 VMs in our VMs folder, and we don't have any templates yet. So before we convert, which is what I'd like to do in this demonstration, before we convert this Linux-1 virtual machine into a template, we definitely want to go ahead and remove any media from the logically attached CD/DVD drive. Now currently, with Linux 1 selected and on the Summary tab, here under VM Hardware, it shows that the CD/DVD drive is disconnected, but it's also showing the network adapter is disconnected, and that's because this VM is currently not running. If it was running, it would show us that it was connected to the network. It would also show us that it's connected to a DVD. So what we're going to do is we're going to right-click on this virtual machine, Linux-1, here in the Navigator pane, and from the drop-down, we're going to select Edit Settings. From here, we'll select Virtual Hardware. It is selected by default when we open this window. And then next to the CD/DVD drive 1, currently we have a data store ISO file. By hovering over it, it shows us what that image is. So I'm going to use the drop-down. Instead of saying an ISO image, I'm going to go ahead and say Client Device. And additionally, by default, that client device is not going to be connected at power on, which is perfect. And we'll click on OK. Now, additionally, if there was tweaks and tunes we wanted for this virtual machine before we convert it to a template, we would power it on, make all those changes, and then power it off before we convert it from a VM to a template. Now, if we were going to clone it from a VM to a template, the actual VM could be on or off. But if we're doing the conversion, the VM has to be off. So let's presume for this demonstration that Linux 1 is exactly how we want it now. And what we'll do is we'll right-click on Linux-1. And from the drop-down, we'll hover over Template. And it's from here we can specify Convert to Template. So we'll go ahead and click on Convert to Template. It's asking us to confirm. We'll click on yes, and then if we click on recent tasks down here, it indicates that it just finished. So mark virtual machine as template, and really what it did, it took the VMX configuration file and it renamed it to indicate that it's a template and not a normal VM that can be run. So let me go ahead and minimize back the recent tasks. And if we click on this Linux One template, see the icon changed? And let's also drag and drop it into the templates folder for organizational purposes. So now we have our template in the templates folder, and we have our vCenter server appliance in the VMs folder. And with Linux-1 selected, if we click on the Data Store tab up here in the top, when we deployed Linux One as a real boy, as a real VM, several nuggets ago, we chose the local data store on ESXi2 to be the home for those files. So it didn't change the home for the files. They're still there. And if we look at those files, and we'll do so by clicking on the ESXi2 data store, and what that did was it took us to the storage view with ESXi2 selected, and it put us on the Files tab for that data store. So from here, if we click on the Linux One folder, and we look at the files, check this out. Here is linux-1.vmtx. So it inserted the T there, so instead of a .vmx, it's the vmtx, which indicates it's a template. So our next step is to create a virtual machine from that template. So to do so, we can simply click on this icon here for the VMs and templates. We can find the template, there it is in the templates folder, called Linux-1, and the icon again represents this is the template, and we could right click, and from the drop down, we're going to select new VM from this template. Now we also have the option here of convert this to a virtual machine, and the question might come up, why would we do that? Well, let's say that there's some additional tweak or a new patch or something else that we wanted to incorporate into a template. Well, we can't modify the template itself, so what we'd have to do to apply a patch to the guest operating system is we can convert it to a virtual machine, run the virtual machine, make the changes, and when it's all perfect, we could then convert it back to a template. So that's the scoop on that. So if we want to create a new virtual machine from this template, which is our purpose right now, we'd simply click on the menu option, New VM from this template. And now it's asking us for a name of the virtual machine. And let's call this Linux-VM1. And it's asking us where we want to put it. If we wanted to put the new VM that we're creating right in the data center, we could, but check this out. If we expand that, because we have some folders, including the VMs folder, we can select that, and then the new VM will be placed in that folder. So we'll click Next to continue. Now it's asking, hey, what's the compute resource you want to use as the host for this new VM? And you know who we haven't really used yet? It's good old ESXi3. So I'm going to click on ESXi3. And with ESXi3 selected as the host we're going to run this VM on, we'll click on Next. So regarding the new virtual machine, we have the option of doing thin provisioning, which simply means this. If the virtual machine has a logical 16 gigabyte drive, but it's only using 2 gigabytes, we're only going to tie up the 2 gigs on the data store. So that's what thin provisioning is all about. The other two options here are both regarding thick provisioning, which says if the virtual machine believes it has a 16 gigabyte drive, then we're going to allocate all 16 gigabytes right now. And what the eager zero refers to is that 16 gigs is going to be zeroed out the moment that disk is created for that VM. And with lazy zeroed, we're still allocating with thick provisioning the entire 16 gigs on the data store, but vSphere is not going to go out and zero out all that space until that VM is turned on for the first time. So if we're creating dozens and dozens of virtual machines, there's going to be less overhead all at once if we do lazy zeroed, because those virtual machines can be turned on, for example, at staggered intervals, and we can kind of distribute out over a little bit of time the zeroing out of those virtual machines' hard drives. Again, as they're being powered on with lazy zeroed. The other option here is same format as source. So in the template, if it's thin provisioning, the new VM will use thin provisioning. If the template's using thick, the new VM will use thick. So in the lab environment, to err on the side of caution, even though our template is based on thin provisioning, I'm going to specify thin provisioning here as well. And now we get a choice of which data store do we want to use to be the home for this new virtual machine's files. And why do we have these three choices? It's because these are the three data stores that ESXi3 has access to. Its local data store, the NFS-based data store, and the iSCSI-based data store. To choose the data store we want to use, we simply click on it. So we're going to use the iSCSI-data store, and with it selected, we'll click on Next. And next it's asking us, do we want to power on the virtual machine after it's created? If we do, we'll put a check in that checkbox. It's also asking us here, do we want to customize the operating system as we deploy this VM? So if we say yes to the customization, what it's expecting is it's expecting us to use a customization specification that has the details regarding that customization. So I'm going to leave that check in the checkbox, even though we don't have a customization specification yet, because if we click on Next, which we'll do right now, it's giving us the opportunity to choose a customization specification. But if we don't have one, it also gives us an opportunity to create one right here. So we can click on the Create icon right here to create a new specification, and that'll open up the wizard for us to create that. Now, actually, what's happening when we click here, it's going to go ahead and minimize this window back to our work in progress. It'll open up the customization wizard, let us do that work, and when we're done, it'll take us back to this current spot. So that's what's happening behind the scenes. So we'll go ahead and click on the icon for Create a New Specification. And let's name this Linux-Custom-Specification. So the target VM in this wizard assumes that we're using Linux because that's what the actual template had specified. So when we originally created the VM that we converted to the template, as part of that creation process, it asked us, hey, what intended operating system do you plan on using? And we said Linux. So that's why it's showing up here. If the template was a template for a Microsoft operating system, we would be creating in this wizard a custom specification for a Windows-based computer. We could add a description, which is helpful to remember. For example, okay, what does that custom specification do? You might have dozens of them that you might want to use, and having descriptions will help you remember what they're for. In our case, we have one here for Linux, so we'll click on Next. The second step of our customization is to specify how do we want to name our VMs. We can go ahead and put a name in here and append a numeric value so that they're unique, or we can say use the virtual machine name. So if we create a new virtual machine called Linux-1 or Linux-2, it'll simply use that as the computer name. And then for the domain name, let's go ahead and use nuggetlab.com, and we'll click on Next. It's asking for a time zone, so I'm going to go ahead and from the drop down for the area, I'm going to specify America. And then as we scroll down, there's Los Angeles, which is Pacific time zone, which is great. And then down below, we have the hardware clock set to, and I'm going to go ahead and say local time as opposed to UTC as part of this specification, and click on Next. Then the custom spec is asking us about the network configuration. The top radio button is using standard network settings, including DHCP and all interfaces, or we could manually select the settings. And we can use the plus symbol here to add multiple NICs, and then we could further specify exactly how we want them to be configured. So for example, NIC 1, click on the little pencil to edit that. Then we can specify the details for IPv4 for this interface, and also for IPv6. So I'm going to click on Cancel, and I'm going to choose to use the standard network settings, including DHCP, and we'll click on Next. And now it's asking about DNS and domain settings. So if we put this new VM on the VM network, that is network 10.3.3, and there is our Windows 2016 server with an interface on that network, the VM network, that is providing DNS services. So that's the DNS server we're going to point to. And then for the DNS search path, let's go ahead and use nuggetlab.com. So if we apply this customization specification to a new VM that we're deploying, that DNS search path, if the client had to resolve a name like Bubba and it failed, it would then append the nuggetlab.com after that, and it would do a resolution request for bubba.nuggetlab.com, which could be helpful. So we'll click on Next to continue, and it says ready to complete, and here's a summary. Also on the left-hand side, you can click on these to go back to any spot that you want, as opposed to just doing back, 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 or next, next, next. And that can be handy to go back and change a parameter. So we'll click on Ready to Complete on the left, and we'll click on Finish. And what it's doing now, it closed that customization wizard, and now it's taking us back to our work in progress, which was the deploy from template. And so currently, we're on this step right here, which is selecting a customization specification. And that's the one we just created. So if we want to use it, all we need to do is click on it. And with that selected, we can click on Next. And then we can review the details and simply click on Finish to deploy that virtual machine. So if we click on Recent Tasks down here in the bottom left, we can see here it's working on it. So it's basically cloning from the template to create the new virtual machine. And that might take a few minutes. So it says it's done. Fantastic. What I'd also like to show you is where we would go in the interface if we wanted to create some customization specifications. So to get there, we can go ahead and hover over the Home icon here at the top. And then from the drop down, let's go ahead and click on Home. I'm also going to go ahead and minimize the recent tasks to give us more real estate here. And then here on the Home tab, we have this icon here for Customization Specification Manager, and that's where we would go to create additional customization specifications. So if we click on that, there's our Linux specification. We could go ahead and edit it. We could also go ahead and create additional customization specifications, including some for Windows, that we could then go ahead and use as we deploy virtual machines. So let's go back. We could use the back option here in Navigator, which is convenient. We can select recent objects to go to one of our previous objects, or we could hover over the home icon again, go ahead and then click on VMs and templates, for example, and it would take us right there. So we'll click on VMs and templates. It took us to the VMs and templates tab. And currently on that template, we have the data stores tab opened up because that's where we left it. We can also see here in our VMs folder that we have our Linux-VM1 machine. It's currently running because we said we wanted to automatically start it, and it applied the customization specification to it. And one thing that you definitely want to be aware of is whether it's Linux or Windows, when that machine first powers up, you want to leave it alone for several minutes because it may have to reboot multiple times as it applies those changes. And that's significantly more important with Windows, especially if it's changing SIDs or joining domains or doing other elements that it needs to do. It may require multiple reboots. So the first time you power on a machine, don't jump in there and start doing a lot of work, because it may not be done applying all the information from the customization specification as instructed. So I and many others have discovered that a lot of frustration can be avoided by simply giving a brand new virtual machine you've powered on for the first time several minutes to do the customization before we log on to it and start looking at the details of that virtual machine. So it's been a few minutes. Let's go ahead and click on the Linux-VM. So there's a little image of what the screen looks like. Here's the IP address, 10.33.102. It's got VMware Tools running, and that's because the template had VMware Tools as part of it. It's on the new-VM network, again, courtesy of the template being on that. There's no CD/DVD attached, and that's because we removed it from the VM before we converted that VM to a template. The host is ESXi3, and the data store being used is the iSCSI data store. So if we wanted to jump over there and just verify it, we could click on this icon here. That would get us over to a console. And then if we click on the little mouse in the upper left-hand corner, and let's go ahead and bring up Terminal Emulator. And I'm going to click on the little plus symbol right here to maximize that. Let's go ahead and do an NSLOOKUP VMware.com. So NSLOOKUP is a fantastic tool. There's the DNS server we use, 10.33.100. We made the DNS request on UDP port 53. And we got the IP address for VMware.com back from our DNS server. So our DNS server, our internal one, went out to the external DNS server world, got the information, cached it, and fed it back to the client. Also, if we did a ping out to VMware.com and pressed enter, this is also going to verify not only name resolution is working, but also connectivity. So I'm going to do a Control-C to go ahead and stop the ping. And that, my friend, is how simple and easy it is to deploy a virtual machine from a template. And so I'm going to press F11 to exit full screen mode, go back to the vSphere client, and let's deploy one more virtual machine from that template. So we'll right-click on Linux-1, the template. From the drop-down, we'll go ahead and specify we want a new VM from this template. We'll call it Linux-VM2. We'll go ahead and place it inside the folder called VMs. Click on Next. Let's go ahead and host this second one on ESXi2. Click on Next. For the format, let's go ahead and use thin provisioning. And to mix this up, let's specify the NFS data store as the data store to use for this VM's files. And click on Next. Let's power on the machine after it's created, and also do the customization specification. Click on Next. And because we have the specification already created, we can simply select it, click on Next, and then click on Finish. And that new VM is now being created. If we click on Recent Tasks, we can see the progress bar as that VM is being deployed. So we'll let that finish. I'm going to minimize the recent tasks. And then once it's done, it's going to power on because we told it to. And again, I would recommend you give it 2 or 3 minutes so it can do any reboots it needs to as it applies the customization specification. Now, as it's being built, we might have some messages like this. There's no network assigned to this virtual machine. But have no fear. Once it's done, it'll be a functioning VM in our vSphere environment. And just to make sure, I'm going to go back to recent tasks and make sure that we're still getting progress here in the creation of that virtual machine based on the template. And now, my friend, it is your opportunity. Take some time in the provided hands-on labs and get some practice creating a template and deploying a couple of virtual machines from that template. And I'll see you in the next video. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.